My grandfather always said the authority never sends its worst men to condemn a crop. They send the ones who can watch something die and not blink, because blinking costs time, and time costs the company money. Warden Callum Drask didn't blink. I want that on record before I tell you the rest. We lived out past the reach on a strip of red dirt called Amber Hollow, where the colony's agricultural office had been running a seed stock program since before I was born. Off-world pods, shipped in cold crates, meant to grow into fiber crop for the shipyards. Most of them took. Some didn't. The ones that didn't were logged as failed stock and burned in the pit behind the processing shed. And nobody thought twice about it. Because a seed that doesn't sprout in 6 months is just a seed that doesn't sprout. I found mine in the reject bin the spring I turned 12. It was smaller than the others, dark and woody, with a seam along one side like a scar that had healed wrong. The manifest tag said inert, non-viable cull. I don't know why I put it in my coat instead of the pit. My grandfather says some things choose you before you've decided anything at all. I kept it in a crate of dry moss under my cot for 3 weeks before it split open on its own, quiet, in the middle of the night, and something climbed out that was not a plant. It was the size of a barn cat, dark-furred going to bark brown along its spine, with a low ridge of soft thorn quills that hadn't hardened yet and eyes like wet river stone. It looked at me the way you look at a door you weren't sure would open. Then it walked straight into my lap and went asleep, and that was that. I named it Root, because I hadn't known any better name yet, and because it still smelled like the moss it had been buried in. I should have reported it. I didn't. My grandfather found out inside a week. You can't hide a growing predator from a man who's lived 70 years on that dirt, and he didn't report it either. He just said, feed it right and keep it out of Drask's inspection log, and went back to mending fence like he hadn't said anything unusual at all. Root grew fast. By midsummer it was the size of a hunting hound, its bark-plated hide thickened along the shoulders, and the thorn quills had gone stiff and dark, capable of drawing blood if you weren't careful, though it was never once careless with me. It slept curled against my legs. It followed me to the well and back, ears swiveling at every sound that wasn't mine. When my grandfather's knee gave out on the porch steps one evening, Root was under his arm before he hit the ground, taking the weight of him like it had done it 100 times. It ate what a Bram eats, which my grandfather looked up in an old field manual, and did not tell me about until later, because he said I didn't need to lie awake over it. What I did see, every day, was a creature that could have broken my arm without trying, lying still while I picked burrs out of its mane, or setting its huge head in my lap during a storm like it was the one who needed comforting instead of the other way around. There was a night, deep into the dry season, when a pack of scree runners came down off the ridge after our chickens. I heard them before I saw them, that thin, chittering bark they make when they've decided a fence isn't going to stop them. I went out with nothing but a lantern, which my grandfather would have skinned me for if he'd been awake to see it, and Root was already there ahead of me, planted in the gap in the coop wire like he'd been standing guard his whole life instead of sleeping at the foot of my cot an hour before. He didn't tear into them. He didn't have to. He just stood there, quiet and enormous, thorn mane half raised, and the whole pack turned and went back up the ridge the way water runs backward off a rock. I stood there a moment after they'd gone, lantern shaking in my hand, and Root pressed his head against my knee like nothing had happened. That was the night I stopped thinking of him as something I was raising, and started thinking of him as something that had decided on its own to raise me right back. My grandfather noticed things too. He started calling Root the third hand around here without meaning it as a joke. And once, when a fever took me hard that summer, he told me, years later, laughing about it, that Root hadn't left my bedside for 2 days straight, not for food, not for water, until the fever broke and I sat up and asked for soup like nothing had happened. The trouble came at the end of that summer when the authority ran its annual reconciliation, counting every pod against the manifest, alive or ash. 14 units unaccounted for the year I found Root, and 13 of them had simple explanations. Mine didn't. Warden Drask came out to Amber Hollow himself, which told you how seriously they took an unmatched number. He brought 2 enforcement men in gray coats and a portable incinerator unit on a cart, the same kind used on the failed stock every year. He stood on our porch with the manifest tablet in his hand and told my grandfather flat that unlogged stock was a breach of colonial biosecurity and would be destroyed on sight, no exceptions, effective immediately. "There's no stock here," my grandfather said, "just a boy and his dog." Drask smiled the way men smile when they already know they're going to win. "Then he won't mind us looking in the barn." I could have run. I thought about it, grabbing Root and taking the north fence line into scrub where the enforcement cart couldn't follow. But Root was already coming out from behind the barn on his own, drawn by my grandfather's raised voice, and there was no hiding a creature that size once he stood in open ground. The 2 enforcement men went for their sidearms. Drask went very still, the way a man goes still when the numbers in his head stop adding up. Root was no longer the size of a hunting hound. He stood taller than my shoulder at the withers, bark-plated hide gone to deep gray-brown, thorn mane fanned wide along his neck like a warning nobody in gray coats had been trained to read. "Stand down," Drask said to me, to my grandfather, to the animal itself, as if any of us took orders from him. I did the only thing I knew how to do. I said, "Easy, Root," the same flat, quiet voice I used every night when I put him to bed, and I walked toward him instead of away. He came to me the way he always came to me, head low, huge and gentle, and pressed his skull against my chest hard enough to nearly put me on the ground. Then he turned, slow and deliberate, and put his whole bulk between me and the men with the sidearms, and he did not growl. He didn't need to. 600 pounds of bark-plated predator standing calm and immovable said everything a growl would have said, and said it better. One of the enforcement men took a step back without seeming to decide to. Drask's hand, halfway to the incinerator cart's activation panel, stopped moving. "That thing," Drask said, "was logged inert." "He wasn't inert," my grandfather said. "He was patient. There's a difference, and you people never bothered learning it." Drask looked at Root a long moment, really looked, the way you look at something you'd already decided couldn't exist. Then he looked at the 2 men flanking him, both of whom had gone quiet and careful in a way that had nothing to do with orders. A warden who can't get his own crew to move on his say-so isn't a warden anymore. He's just a man standing in a yard, losing an argument to a boy and a beast who never raised his voice. "Get the cart off my land," my grandfather said, "and log him as viable stock, gone to private care, before I write my own report about what almost happened here today." Drask did not argue. He signed the tablet with a hand that wasn't quite steady, and the enforcement men wheeled the incinerator cart back down the track without looking behind them, and that was the last time anyone from the authority set foot on Amber Hollow. Folks in the settlement heard about it within the week, the way frontier news always travels faster than the people carrying it. They started calling what Root did the second Root. The idea that something written off as dead ground could still put down roots twice, could still choose to grow toward the one person who'd been patient with it. I didn't coin the phrase. I just lived inside it. Root is fully grown now, and he still sleeps across the foot of my cot most nights, too big for it by half, bark-plated shoulder rising and falling slow in the dark. He still comes when I say his name in that same flat, easy voice. He still puts his skull against my chest when the wind gets bad. And somewhere in a filing office 3 systems over, there's a manifest that reads viable, gone to private care, and underneath it, in my grandfather's handwriting, a note nobody at the authority ever had the nerve to argue with again. Some things aren't failed stock. Some things are just waiting for somebody patient enough to notice.